And many times we are the only advertisement for the Lord's church anybody will ever see or hear. And my example can either help or hinder evangelistic efforts. We need to understand that. I can draw people to Christ by my example, or I can drive away from Christ by my example. And that's why example is so important. Now, that brings us to where we left off last week. We may have gotten into this just a little bit. For some reason, it looks familiar to me, but I don't think we did. Holiness. We're looking at some questions about the Christian's relationship to the world. Now, holiness is something that we cannot go to heaven without. Now, let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. Someone, if you would, just read verse 14.
Follow after peace with all men and the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord.
Okay? Holiness, American Standard has sanctification. That's a synonymous term. Those really are the same thing. And you know, somebody might say, well, I'm not really sure what holiness is, and I'm even less sure or equally unsure about sanctification. So sometimes we throw terms out without making sure we understand them. What's a very simple, just common sense definition of holiness or sanctification, either one of those terms? Set apart. It's the idea of being set apart for a specific purpose. I've mentioned to you before, Reagan's dad, his saying at camp always is he'll pick out 2 or 3 of the older teenagers and say at the end of our singing or at the end of worship tonight, I want you to be the ones to pick up the songbooks. And so he'll tell everybody, make sure you pass your songbooks over here to a certain direction, to this end of the pews. And, so-and-so over here, make sure you place those songbooks into the sanctified hands of brother so-and-so. It's the idea that they've been set apart for that specific task. We use, though, that term in a spiritual sense, obviously because the Bible does over and over again, but it literally just carries the idea of being set apart. And so Christians are sanctified, set apart. In fact, you've heard before, no doubt, the word translated church, ecclesia. Ek meaning out of, the latter part coming from the root word kaleo, which means to call. And so it's the idea of being called out. And that's the same idea, set apart, called out. Well, from what? From darkness into light, from the world to being in Christ. And so that's the idea. So you can't go to heaven without holiness or without sanctification or without being set apart. Christians are not like the world. Sometimes people get the idea that Christians are, different in the sense of just being weirdos, and that's not what the idea is in the New Testament. But it is being set apart. There are things that the Christian doesn't do. There are shows and movies that the Christian doesn't watch. There are things that the Christian doesn't listen to, and on and on we could go. So holiness is something that we cannot go to heaven without. 1 Peter 2:9 is where he talks about him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that's what we're talking about with this concept of ecclesia. Romans 12. I got my 1 and my dash reversed there. Romans 12, 1 and 2 is what that's supposed to say. Let's go to Romans 12. Who's got that? Okay.
I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
All right. In Hebrews 12:14, the statement is made, holiness without which no man shall see the Lord. Here you have Paul, and he's begging in the sense of Look, I want you to go to heaven, and this is the difference in going to heaven and being lost in hell. I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. You know, the idea of sacrifice is something that, you know, even a cursory knowledge of the Old Testament, you see sacrifices are integral, or were integral, to the Mosaic system. And he says, you know, we're not offering animal sacrifices now. Jesus is our sacrifice for us. But in the sense of the worship that we present, you know, Israel would come before God and they would present sacrifices. Jesus is the atonement sacrifice, the ultimate, once for all time atonement. But those idea of the daily sacrifice and thanksgiving offerings and so on and so forth under the Mosaic law, we do that now because Christians are priests. And that goes back to 1 Peter 2:9. We are a holy priesthood. And so we're offering sacrifices. We're not out offering animals. We're offering ourselves as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God. And of course, there's the idea of holiness, which is your reasonable service. And he goes on and he says to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you can prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. The Greek word translated transformed is metamorphao, which of course sounds a lot like metamorphosis. We're familiar with that. There's a transformation that takes place. And so transformed is a very good way of looking at that. And that's a process. That's an ongoing process. We're trying, you know, we sometimes say, you know, use the expression trying to grow more and more like Jesus every day. And there are times when we fall short. We make that right and we learn from it and we do better. But we've got to be striving every day to be more like Jesus, to transform our lives from the old man into the new man as Jesus would have us to be. That's the idea there, and it involves holiness, being set apart and being transformed into the image of his Son. Titus 2. Let's go look at Titus 2, 11 and 12. Grace is something that is often misunderstood. I think I've told you before about Brother Glenn Hitchcock. He is, I just went blank. Miss Joyce, is it Warner Robins? Is that right? Warner Robins. There's a congregation over in Warner Robins, and Brother Hitchcock, he serves as one of the elders, right, Miss Joyce? That's where Justin and Anna worship. But he's now serving as one of the elders. He's preached for a number of years, but he told me about it. In fact, I think I've got it somewhere. I'm pretty sure he emailed it to me, and I saved it in my files. I've not preached it yet, but a sermon that he wrote a long time ago, and he said he likes to preach at several places, and it's called, the name of the sermon is A Teacher Called Grace. And so it's from this passage, Titus 2, 11 and 12. Who's got that?
For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age.
All right, so he very clearly says the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. All right, so God's grace that brings salvation has appeared to how many people? To everybody, right? And salvation is by grace through faith. Now, it's not a dead faith. It's not an inactive faith. And, you know, we covered that when we talked about salvation, questions about salvation. But salvation is by grace through faith. Well, God's grace has appeared to all men. Are all men going to be saved? Well, the Bible's very clear about that, right? In fact, Jesus says, few there be that find it, right? So what's the difference? Well, the difference is in verse 12. What's the first word? Teaching. That's referencing grace. God's grace has appeared to all men. Of course, that's ultimately a reference to Jesus. God's grace has appeared to all men in the form of Jesus Christ. It's appeared to all men, but not all men are going to be saved. Why? Because not all people obey the teacher. And it's a teacher called grace. Grace teaches us that we should deny ungodliness and worldly lust, and we should live, there's the negative aspect of it, and then there's the positive aspect, which is that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world, or this present age, some versions have. So grace teaches us how to be holy. If you want to know, well, how can I be holy? you're going to have to learn from a teacher called Grace. And her textbook is right here. And of course, again, ultimately it's reference to Jesus. So I guess what we should more properly say his textbook is right here. And even more specific, the New Testament. So if we want to learn how to be holy, we've got to go to the book. James 1:27 and 4:4. Let's look at the book of James. James 1:27. Who wants it? All right, Brother Ricky. Okay? Pure religion, undefiled before God and the Father, is to visit the fatherless or the orphans and widows in their affliction. It doesn't mean just visit. It carries the idea of serving, checking in on them. If there's something that they need, maybe it's something that needs to be done, whatever. I told you before, I heard a preacher tell this, and it was told for the truth, but I said, there was some folks that went by to check on a little Christian widow, lived by herself, and went to check on her and just kind of stopped by real quick and said, well, just wanted to let you know we're praying for you. And she said, well, while you're praying for me, can you get in there and help me with the dishes? The dishes were piling up, and she needed some help. She couldn't get around very well, couldn't stand at the sink for a long period of time. And, it was kind of a nice way of saying, look, I understand that and I appreciate that, but there's more to it than just checking by and say, well, hey, we're praying for you. It's sometimes it's sitting down for a visit. Sometimes it's there's a need there that we can fulfill. So that's the idea when he says visit. But the last part of that is what we're looking at, to keep himself unspotted from the world. And Brother Ricky, if you don't mind, while you're there, are you still there? James 4:4. All right, some very strong language, and really drawing back to imagery from the Old Testament. There is some very, very plain, strong language in the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel, I think maybe some in Jeremiah, about Israel's spiritual adultery. And particularly in their case, it was idolatry. But God calls it spiritual adultery. They were married to God in that figurative spiritual sense. The church, of course, according to Ephesians 5, is the bride of Christ. And so there can still be that spiritual adultery today, and trying to befriend the world and be friends with the world, while at the same time saying, well, I'm a part of the bride of Christ. Well, that's spiritual adultery. And he says, whoever would be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. And that is very strong language. And if there's anybody ever you don't want as an enemy, it is the Almighty. And then finally, 1 John 2:15 through 17, a familiar passage. First John 2:15 through 17. Okay? We've talked before the three avenues of sin: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Anything in any generation, in any dispensation, any kind of sin, it entices through one or more of those three avenues. And so sometimes somebody will say, well, they didn't have this back in those days to be tempted by. They had the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life. And that's the devil's three avenues of tempting people to sin. Everything will come down to one or more of those three categories of tempting someone to sin. He also points out in verse 17, the world is temporary. This kind of reminds us of the end of 2 Corinthians 4 and on into chapter 5, verse 1. The world's temporary, but the ones who do the will of God, they abide forever. And so why would we latch ourselves onto, spiritually speaking, the world when it's the things of this world, they're fleeting, they're temporary, but the things of the Spirit, things that are spiritual in nature, are the things that really matter. It's kind of like chasing an extra dollar or the fellow who's just working nonstop, not because he's just got to feed his family, but because he's just trying to get more and more, or he becomes obsessed with his job and to the neglect of his family. He's getting wrapped up in things that are temporary, and he's forgetting the things that matter most. I heard a quote one time, and I love it. It said, the things that matter most in this world really aren't things. It's people. Things that are spiritual in nature, whether it be talking about people or serving God, worshiping God. Those are the things that really matter, because those are the things that are going to last beyond this life. And sometimes we can forget that if we're not careful. But he says, don't love the world, nor the things that are in the world. If you love the world, the love of the Father is not in you. And isn't that what it really gets down to? So many times, we're not talking about a stumbling. Everybody's going to make mistakes. Even when we're walking faithfully in the Lord, we're going to make mistakes. There are times when we stumble. But sometimes some folks, when you try to help somebody to be faithful, or you're trying to get somebody to obey the gospel and become a Christian, to get their lives right, sometimes when you get down to it, you discover here's a person that their love is not for God. It's for the world. And there may be some love for God, but they love the world more. Or maybe they say, well, I like these things, but I like God too. I love God. But Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, no man can serve two masters. Jesus says he wants all your heart, not a divided heart. And it's challenging because Satan uses those avenues, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And he'll make things so enticing and look so good and tempt us so much to love the things of this world. He will try to allure us toward the world. But we have to remember it's temporary. Those things are temporary. But when we serve God faithfully, when we follow him faithfully, that lasts through eternity. So some New Testament principles about a Christian's relationship to the world. All this really is to come down to holiness, being set apart. Don't love the world. Don't get caught up in the world. Be set apart from the world. And sometimes there's just almost an obsession, sometimes with young folks, sometimes with older folks, to fit in, to be just like everybody else. And, it's like Israel wanting a king. We want to be like all the other nations. They have a king, and their king goes out to war for them and all this, and we want to be like them. And sometimes that's what it comes down to. And again, that can be tempting. We have to understand what's temporary versus what is eternal. And when we put that into perspective, then it loses that allure. Anything else on that before we move on to the next slide? All right, next question here. Absent a specific statement, I shortened this a little bit. I think it's worded a little bit differently in the booklet. Absent a specific New Testament statement, how can a Christian, or how may a Christian make a good decision? Yes, sir.
You need to ask John, because his class is all about that.
Do what?
Ask John McDaniel, because his class is all about that.
Oh, that's what the Sunday morning class in the fellowship hall has been all about. Well, so I'm about to repeat a lot of stuff, I guess, for some of you folks. But yeah, I mean, it's sometimes people want to know about this. They say, well, I have a decision to make. The Bible doesn't specifically say thou shalt not or thou shalt do this. How do I make a good decision? It may be something that is, you say, well, I'm not too sure about this if it's right. It may be something that, it may even be a decision that no right or wrong answer necessarily. What college should I go to? Should I go to college at all? Should I go do like a trade school? Should I just go get a job after high school? Things like that. But we're talking about this would fall more in the realm of, I don't make a decision between something I'm just not sure about. Maybe there's somebody over here that says, Chad, you don't need to do that. That's not right. And that's not practicing holiness. That's not practicing being set apart from the world. Somebody else over here saying, no, don't listen to that guy. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. You can do that. That's not sinful. That's not wrong. So sometimes, you just kind of say, okay, how can I make a decision? This is, absolutely not an exhaustive list. And as Bob just pointed out, Johnny's been covering this, I guess, nearing the end of a quarter, right? So, there's obviously a lot that could be said about this, but in a class such as this, we're going to kind of touch the hem of the garment here. But the Bible doesn't say this is okay, this is not okay. How do I decide? There are some biblical principles. We already covered Titus 2:11 and 12. The grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us. Well, grace teaches if we're willing to listen and if we're willing to get in the book and study. There's also the concept of Romans 12:9. Let me get 2 volunteers, and we'll get Romans 12:9 and somebody else for Philippians 2. All right, Romans 12:9 and all right, Brother Gary, Philippians 2:3-5. You got that one, Brother Tim?
Yes.
Okay.
Let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good.
All right, so there's the principle of hating what is evil and loving what is good. And somebody says, well, okay, but I'm unsure about this. Is it evil? Is it good? No, we're just talking about a biblical principle there. Philippians 2:3-5.
Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, that each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also the interest of others.
All right, so he says, don't do things through strife or vainglory. We might just say simply pride. Don't do things just because of pride. Selfish interest, in other words. And of course, he goes on and points out in verse 4, don't look out just for your own things, look out for the things of others. There's a principle that'll help guide a lot of decisions. Is this something that is just selfish and all about me? Am I considering influence? And we talked about example earlier in this particular section, so I'm not going to reteach all that. But is this something that's going to, harm my example or hurt my influence with a particular person or anyone else? That's something to think about. And of course, verse 5, let this mind be in you which was in Christ Jesus, having the mind of Christ. How do I have the mind of Christ, Chad? Well, you got to get into his book. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, no man knows the things of the Spirit except the Spirit of God. And he says God has revealed them unto us. And he goes on and says that, we're comparing spiritual things with spiritual words. And that's what the New Testament is. It's God, really the whole Bible, but in particular for us as Christians, living in the Christian dispensation, the New Testament is the revelation of God's mind to us. And it doesn't mean he's told us everything. There's some things that are not revealed. Some things, Brother Blaine used to say all the time, he'd kind of smile and say, some things you just have to live right, go to heaven, and ask God when you get there. But if you want to have the mind of Christ, you got to study the book. I think there are some helpful questions that we can ask, though, when we're considering a matter. Is this okay? Is it not okay? Is it something I should abstain from doing? A lot of times, just I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of times just the doubt. The doubt is saying, I'm not real sure about that. Many times that tells you something. If nothing else, it's telling you something about your conscience. And we could go and study Romans 14 if we had more time and talk about, Paul says, don't go against your conscience. Was it Jiminy Cricket that always used to say, let your conscience be your guide? Is that right? That's not a good motto. You need to let the Bible be your guide. But also understanding that the conscience can be trained, because sometimes people grow up around something. There are people that grow up in an environment where everybody's just drinking all the time, drinking alcohol. And so they may not have a bit of conscience issue with drinking alcohol. But then they begin to study the Scriptures and see what the Bible has to say about this. And they begin to train their conscience and realize, that's something that a Christian doesn't have anything to do with. And so the conscience can be trained. So you can't let your conscience be your guide. But in Romans 14, what Paul's essentially telling us is, and especially for those weak brethren, your conscience is your last line of defense. You start ignoring your conscience, especially a properly trained conscience, and you start searing your conscience, and you're in trouble. because when the conscience becomes seared, then it becomes harder and harder for the Word of God to prick our hearts. And so you got to be careful about that. But sometimes just when people come to me and they say, Chad, I'm really not sure about this decision. I don't know if this is right, and I can just see it. I can see it in the nonverbal language, and I can hear it in the way they communicate verbally, even that there are doubts. And sometimes I'll say, and I knew before you even told me what you're asking about, you know the answer to this, even if it's just in your particular situation for you. Paul in Romans 14, he's talking about eating meats particularly that were offered to idols. And so, and he covers this also in 1 Corinthians 8. We know an idol's nothing, Paul says. But if someone who comes out of an idolatrous background, they ate of that stuff in worship of idols. They can't just eat of that and just think, well, it's a meal. To them, it's like you're partaking of worshiping that idol. And so they can't do that. And Paul says, you don't need to go. He tells the weaker brethren that have that problem, he says, you don't need to go around condemning someone just because they eat meat. But he also says to the stronger brethren that have that understanding, you don't need to go around and try to compel them. Oh, you need to get over that. Eat the meat. It's okay. Quit being silly and petty. He says, don't do that either. So, conscience. That's a big consideration. One question we can ask is, what kind of example would I be setting, good or bad? Now, again, we covered this one earlier, but that is a question. If there's a situation where I say, I'm not sure, the Bible doesn't address this directly, I'm not sure if it's okay, I'm not sure if it's not okay, if doing that or partaking of that or whatever hurts your example, then I need to stay away from that. Another question is, would I feel comfortable doing or saying this in the presence of my Lord? That's a consideration. And that's someone that's sometimes hard to picture because, the Lord is not here in a physical presence. But think about that. And really, you could add to that, maybe would I be comfortable doing this in the presence of my parents, if it's a young person, or, fill in the blank, but ultimately in the presence of my Lord. And going right with that would be this next one. Would I be embarrassed if my parents, spouse, or elders found out about this? That can help make a decision in a situation like that. And what is this, number 4? Going right with that, who are some wise Christians I might consult for advice on this matter? Sometimes people just say, well, ask for advice. Well, you better be careful who you go to for advice. Amnon, you remember, had a friend, and this was one of David's sons, and he had this friend who advised him. He just was infatuated with his half-sister. And he has this friend who says, oh, man, I got advice for you. You can pull off this scheme, and he ends up raping his half-sister because he received some advice from a so-called friend. Absalom finds out, he's upset, he's angry, he plots revenge, and ultimately kills Amnon over that. All kinds of problems came from that. So not just advice, but good advice. Let's look at some passages dealing with that. Go to the book of Proverbs. Look at chapter 11, verse 14. Who's got it?
Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors there is safety.
In the multitude of counselors there is safety. You know what sometimes we do, if we're not careful, we don't seek counsel, we go to a yes man. King Ahab, over in 2 Kings, I think. 1st or 2 Kings, one of those. I'm pretty sure it's 2 Kings. King Ahab, he had his yes men Shall we go up to Ramoth Gilead? Yes, go up and prosper. The Lord will be with you. They're not giving him advice. They're just telling him what they knew he wanted to hear. Just yes men. And so sometimes it's good to seek counsel from a number of wise people, faithful Christian people. Proverbs 15:22. All right, without counsel, plans go awry. Multitude of counselors, they are established. So again, the idea of seeking help from more than one wise person. Chapter 20, verse 18 of Proverbs.
Plans are established by counsel, by wise counsel, wage war.
All right, plans are established by counsel. By wise counsel, make war. In other words, you better make sure you know what you're doing. This is in the context of a king. You don't want to just go and start any old war. There may be costs you're not considering. There may be casualties you're not considering. There may be all kinds of things. And sometimes, we go to war personally without getting some good advice. And somebody might say, here's a better solution. And how many times we pass up on the better solution? All right, chapter 24, verse 6.
For by wise counsel you will wage your own war, and in multitude of counselors there is safety.
All right, there's the same concept. By wise counsel make war, and multitude of counselors, there is safety. So the idea there is getting advice, but again, it's making sure that it's good advice. You're not seeking just a yes man or anything like that. 1 Kings 12, it begins at verse 6, but in fact, I think we talked about this recently, where Rehoboam, the people come to him, they say, your father Solomon, he made things hard on us, and lighten the load. And we want you to lighten the load that Solomon placed upon us. Give me 3 days, he says, I'll think about it, and then I'll give you an answer. And so over the 3 days, he goes to the old men. The old men say, lighten their load, and they'll serve you. They'll be your faithful subjects for the duration of your reign. Rehoboam goes to the young men, and they say, I tell them, my little finger's going to be thicker than my father's thigh, and he chastised you with whips, I'm going to chastise you with scorpions and all that, and you tell them basically says, the young men said, you tell them they ain't seen nothing. They're going to see what it's like to have a heavy burden. And he listened to their advice, and it split the kingdom. So, careful who you go to for advice. It makes a difference, doesn't it? Let's go to 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 5. Look at verses 21 and 22.
Prove all things, hold fast that which is good, abstain from all appearance of evil.
All right, so prove all things, test all things, some versions have. Hold fast or cling to what is good. You hold on to what's good. Test it. If it turns out that it's good, then you hang on to that. If it's not, obviously, let it go. And he says, abstain from all appearance or every appearing of evil. When something turns out that it's evil, stay away from it. And that's the concept behind what we're going to look at here in this next one. I've seen various versions of this. In fact, some of these are very similar to Brother Mike Karras did a lesson. I don't know how long ago that's been, Mike, but the bookmark you gave out last year. And some of these are very similar to what was on the bookmark, and that was excellent stuff. So I know some of this may be repetition, but I ran across a little different version of it, and I thought it was good to include here with this. There is the personal test. I know for the folks in the back that may be pretty small print. I was trying hard to get it onto one slide here. The personal test. Will it make me better or worse as a Christian? So you can ask yourself that question. Is this going to make me better as a child of God or worse? There is the social test. And that goes back to example. Will it influence others to be better or worse as Christians? Will it draw them to the Savior or drive them away? Then there is the practical test. Will the results of this be desirable? Will the results be desirable? Look at the outcome. Sometimes people call that the fruit test. That's one of the things I tell people about gambling. You want to know something about gambling? Somebody says, well, the Bible doesn't really address this. I think it does, and I've preached on that, so I'm not going to re-preach that sermon. But I think the Bible very clearly addresses that concept. But if you want to know anything about gambling, look at the fruits of it. Everywhere gambling goes, when it comes in, what happens? Are people better for it or worse for it? They're worse every time. I've told you before, when I used to live up in Collinsville, Illinois, we were just across the river from St. Louis, but the town before Collinsville, or it may have been a town or two before Collinsville, but it was due east. You cross over the Mississippi River from St. Louis and you're in Illinois, and the first town is called East St. Louis. And the people up there who used to tell me, I'd had several members of the church tell me, I remember years ago, East St. Louis was a nice place. And now, it's one of those places they say the police hardly even don't much want to go in there at night. Once the sun sets, you can barely get policemen to go some places in that town. And of course, my question when somebody would say something like that was, I don't know if I knew the answer and was just asking to confirm it, or maybe I just didn't realize it. But okay, well, what happened? Those casinos came in, and some of them, the older ones would say, I could just see it go down, down, down. So the fruit test, or a practical test. The universal test. If everyone did this, would it help or hurt society? I sometimes talk about this with various things that sometimes, especially with young folks, and they'll say, well, the Bible doesn't specifically address that. What if everybody did this? Is it going to help society or hurt it? Scriptural test. Does the Bible endorse it or forbid it, whether explicitly or implied? Obviously you want to know if the Bible addresses it directly, then you got your answer there pretty clearly. But that is part of the test, the scriptural test. There's the stewardship test. Is it a waste of God-given talent or resources? None of these necessarily, other than obviously the scriptural test, none of these may not in and of themselves answer it. So there's the stewardship test. There may be more to it than that, but that is something to consider. We are stewards of the blessings that God has given us. We don't own anything. Whether you be talking about material possessions or even time given in a day. We've been given a certain amount of time, 24 hours in a day, and we're to be good stewards of that time. Stewardship. God requires, I'm trying to think of the verse, 1 Corinthians 4:2, I believe. It is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. So, stewardship. Then there's the character test. What will it do to my moral and spiritual influence? We talked about that, very similar to the social test. There's the family test. Will it discredit or dishonor my family or embarrass them? If there's anything that's going to do that, I don't need to be doing that. Publicity test. Would I be willing for friends, fellow Christians, the elders, the preacher, etc., to know about it? We talked about that one just a moment ago as well. And then there is the common sense test. Sometimes things come down to just a common sense test. Does it agree with just plain, everyday, old common sense? There are some things that just from a common sense perspective we can know. All right, no, I don't need to do that. So, common sense test. Then there's the fairness test. Is it honest? Is it practicing the golden rule? Is it doing unto others as I want them to do unto me? That Jesus says that's the way we ought to treat people, like we want to be treated. And then there is the problem test. Is it potentially harmful to me or to others? So there's several there. There is a little bit of overlap in those, but that's just the list I ran across, and I thought that was pretty good. And again, I know some of that's repeating what you all have studied before. So testing all things. It's the idea of, if it's not an issue that the Bible specifically addresses, how do I make a decision? And there are a number of factors that play into that. Yes, sir?
Quick question. How would you address it if somebody says, no, I gamble on a regular basis, but I give half that to the church and I give the other half to some other? How would you handle that?
Well, it doesn't matter what you do with it. If you obtain it by, a sinful means, that'd be like a fella out here dealing dope, and he says, "Man, yeah, I know I'm selling dope, but I give half of it to the church." Well, God doesn't need our money, and so that's. In fact, I can't remember where it was. It was a denomination, if I recall, that some fella, it might have been one of their members, he won the lottery and decided, he's just, he's going to give half of it to his church, as he put it. And that, it was a denomination, as I recall. But to their credit, they said, no, we don't want it because you obtained it through that means. And so, sometimes people give money and you don't know where it came from. As far as there could be a Christian businessman who's cheating in his business, cheating the IRS, things like that, and he's giving money. But here was a situation where they knew, and the guy said, "I've won the lottery, but I'm giving half of it to the church," and they said no, and I commend them for that. But yeah, I mean, that the end doesn't justify the means. That's what that would really fall under. As far as an ethical study, but that's a good question. Anything else?
What would be the difference in a fellow going to rob a bank and he's got the loot in the back of the car and he gives half of it to the church?
Same situation. Somebody Chris mentioned be like somebody robbing a bank, and if he happened to get away with it, and he's maybe his conscience is bothering him or something. Well, I turned around and I gave half of it to the church, so it still doesn't make it right. Wrong is wrong. All right, so I wanted to stop there because my next slide is the next question. What can I do now that will help me to be faithful 10 years from now? And Lord willing, we will cover that. It's the last one in your booklet, right? So, by the way, I have one more booklet. Is anybody missing one or need an extra? All right, I got a taker. Sold. Thank you very much.